Welcome everyone to yet another episode of the Health and Safety Unplugged podcast, brought to you by Advanced Safety. I am joined with someone who is going to be familiar to many of our regular listeners and tuners in. We're joined with DeAnne Brabant, who has been a long-term supporter, an advocate for this podcast and for what we're trying to achieve here, which is shining light on the application of Health and Safety at Work Act and what it actually means in practice, which is often something that we don't get a lot of insight into. So, DeAnne, welcome once again. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm very busy. I've got a wide range of sort of quite interesting health and safety work, some of it doing legal opinions for people about, and mostly actually some of it arising out of this Vicari cases, where people are now wanting to check whether they've got things right in terms of their upstream duties and that sort of thing.
Well, that can only be a positive thing, right? So it's at least there's some positive aspects out of this really horrific case, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, particularly it's shone the light on due diligence because the Battle brothers are being charged under Section 44 as well. Um, and it has drawn people's attention to that. And I think along with the regulator and the health and safety groups like NZISM, etc., there has been a sort of a latent concern that that duty has not been fully embedded or people don't actually understand it at all. And that boards almost think they're buffered from prosecution, even though they're made aware that, each individual board member's officers and persons who, even agents, could be captured by that duty, that they just don't seem to still quite get it and don't seem to have the impetus to want to look at their governance structures and see whether or not they're actually appropriate and their reporting functions. And then also, I suppose you see this too, Matt, who you select to be your health and safety manager, and there's a recent case now where there's now been a prosecution of the health and safety manager, and there was a bit of nepotism there. They hired somebody that was a family member. That they are qualified, that they are appropriate, that they actually, that they, when they make assumptions, they're actually born out of the right things.
Yeah.
And that they're recorded the assumptions so that they can be tested and someone can check them out and see that they're right, that they're subject to peer review and all of those things.
Yes.
Because as you'll see when we get into talking about these Vicari cases, and in particular the Section 34 duty and that, failing to recognise that you're even captured by that duty and they're not putting the right things in place is a very expensive but also human life expensive exercise if you get it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, whilst we're touching on it, in terms of the advice that you would give to officers of businesses of any shape or size here in New Zealand, what are the top tips or pieces of advice you would pass on to them?
First thing is, it comes down to initially an entity selecting its board members in the first place. Like it comes right down to that beginning, embedding them in the organisation, deciding whether or not they are actually a good fit, but also that they actually have the requisite knowledge and that they're actually of the same mindset about health and safety as what you are.
Yeah.
Like you won't be able to change somebody who's different to you and try and bring them on board. You'll have an uphill duty. You actually need to select the right people that actually have the same mantra, have the same beliefs as you. Then you need to, when you bring them in, you need to ensure that they're trained appropriately in health and safety. There's some quite good courses. NZISM do them, the Institute of Directors do them in terms of getting officers up to speed with health and safety, etc. And that's not a one-off thing because you should actually be doing that as a refresher and regularly, just like you would with your employees.
Yes.
For training, that you actually don't assume that, one-off knowledge, one-off training is sufficient. You need to have a process whereby you continue to upskill them, engage them in terms of their health and safety training. Why do I say that? Well, I say that because they need to actually have that inherent sense of risk and understanding about the risks in the workplace, so that when they get reports up from their health and safety officers and other people,
Yep.
that they ask the right questions and that they actually challenge people about, investigation reports, etc., that they call them to account about what's in there, and that they have the requisite knowledge to understand the framework that you're working
Yes, that's
in.
so important, right? Yeah, absolutely.
And so if you don't have that from the outset,
Yeah.
then what happens is that they're just getting these reports up to them at board meetings, which they've got a whole lot of other stuff, and generally they're driven by financials and all the other things that need to be done. And they're just doing them as a tick box exercise. But of course, due diligence involves not only checking on near misses, incidents, and that sort of thing, but actually taking into account when purchasing equipment, etc., what's the safest, what's the most healthiest, what has less decibels, which, you need to be asking those questions. Well, so you're asking me to approve this excavator. Is it actually the safest one, or is it the cheapest one being imported from another entity? And if you're importing it from New Zealand, from outside of New Zealand, what are you going to do to ensure that it's compliant with New Zealand regulations?
Yeah. Thank you. That's great advice, and it always comes as a bit of a shock to some of my past clients, where I've advised the officers, the board of directors, to actually allot time to spend on the floor, to actually walk the walk and to see the team in operation. For many board members, that's a bit of a surprise and a bit of a shock to their system.
And the other thing is sitting alongside a worker and saying, "Show me the JSA for the work that you're doing. Tell me about it."
Yeah, absolutely.
Or actually, orally tell me about it, and then why don't you show me the JSA and talk to me about it?
Yeah.
They do need to understand the business that they're working in. They do need to understand the inherent risks. They do need to actually have that radar to go, oh, our people need to come home safe. And I think, I've done, it was quite fascinating. I did I've done a couple of board talks where I've actually gone in and I mentioned to someone else how I think I'd scared a few of them, and one of them said, "Oh yeah, your infamous talk. I heard about that, and you did scare the board members, and that's why we're in there doing risk assessments and all the rest, because they wanted to know that the right things were being done."
Yeah, that in itself is great. Like, that's such a fantastic outcome.
And I suppose, not selling this up, but I've got a unique perspective, having been a prosecutor at WorkSafe and having to sit in, do sentencings and having to explain to victims about what reparation is about and all the rest in that. And sadly, having to say to them, if they put the right things in place, your partner, your husband, your father probably would have come home from work. That's not to say that there's not accidents. Incidents are different to accidents, and accidents do happen, and people do die in workplaces in really odd situations where nobody understands, and all the Swiss cheese is filled in as best as you can, and still something happens.
Yes.
But that should be few and far between, and I think that's the reason that the due diligence duty was brought in was to actually ensure that the likes of Pike River shouldn't really happen again, that you couldn't say as a CEO, well, I just didn't know. Like, you do need to know, and you need to show interest, and you don't need to, and not just in the financials of the business, not just whether you're solvent or not, but actually whether you're solvent in the health and safety sense, that you're actually taking all reasonably practicable steps, that you can hand on your heart say, we've put all the right things in place. I saw a fascinating talk at the Health and Safety Leaders Summit from the Health and Safety Advisor at the Ports of Auckland about how they've turned things around there. That's that'd be a well worth amazing person to interview her, because she's made such a, and I apologise to her, I've forgotten her name, but she's made such a massive change there. And the videos that they've done with the staff members actually and board members owning health and safety and why they do health and safety and why they do it to go home to their families and all the rest.
Yep.
So that human factors stuff is really, really, really important. And if you're talking about safety too, it's the hearts and minds stuff, right? It's actually not just the paperwork. I've seen paperwork going out, out my ears and piled high, and still people are not doing the right things. And sometimes you've got too much paperwork, so then people actually don't do the right thing because they don't know which paperwork applies and all that stuff. It's about making it really simple and easy. Keep it simple.
Yeah,
so that people can walk away with it. They know what to do. And also the rules around it, from the board it should come. If it's not safe, don't do it. If you question it and you think that you've got a gut feeling that it's not right, then we support you in stepping down from the work, reporting it, and we look at whether or not it is or not. And it doesn't matter if you've got it wrong. If you think you shouldn't do it, don't do it, and talk to us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And gosh, there's so much to unpack even from that there is, particularly in this day and age where we've got all this whiz-bang tech, we've got this arrival of AI, and everyone's getting very excited about all this data that's going to get generated. But the bottom line remains that it's the use of that data that is key here, right? So regardless of whether it's paper-based or if it's electronic, if there isn't someone at the helm who's actually critically considering this information and making informed decisions, then it's pretty much worthless, right?
Well, the AI thing's quite concerning to me. I don't know if you've seen, there's a recent case where a lawyer got AI to do his legal research, and the cases were not correct. They didn't actually even exist because right now AI is a language processor.
Yes.
And I posed some questions about myself and got it to answer them, and it told me that I was admitted about 3 years before I was even admitted to the bar of practicing as a lawyer.
Right.
And I said, what was the source of that? The Herald and Law Talk, an article about you with your health and safety law. I didn't work for WorkSafe until like 2014.
Yeah, right.
So yes, could be good. Yes, it's great for like functional stuff like write me a business plan or whatever, and then you like adjust it to your own circumstances, and it gives you a good framework. But in terms of doing risk assessment, etc., I would be really wary of it. For the reasons that when we get into these discussions about what went wrong with like in-flight charters and GNS, etc.
Yes.
Just relying on AI and saying, what are the risks for slips, trips and falls? Well, that's really simple, right? That's a simple answer. But they don't know what environment you're in or what you're doing or how many slips, trips and falls you've had.
And it comes with a pinch of salt, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you've just mentioned in-flight charters and GNS. Obviously, the hot topic at the moment for the rightfully so is Whakaari White Island court case and the trials that are currently taking place. So, obviously, and for obvious reasons, we're limited to what we can speak to in this recording, but what we can at least speak to are some of the prosecutions that have taken place leading up to today's trials. So in that instance, I'm referring to in-flight charters that were prosecuted in March 2022, where the company were fined $227,500 in order to pay prosecution costs of $40,000. In-flight charters subcontracted tours to Whakaari, but the judge said that the company couldn't hand over safety obligations because it was the face of the tour and a lot more than just a booking agent. So I guess the question I've got in mind, I mean, we spoke to this in our previous sessions, and I'll put a link in the recording so you can go back to that and see exactly what we spoke to. But Considering the potential for high costs associated with not fulfilling health and safety obligations, what advice would you give to organizations to ensure that they meet these obligations effectively, knowing what we do now know?
Yeah, well, look, one of the things I think it might help to explain a little bit more about. Now I'm just going to pull something up so I
Yeah,
can.
sure.
So the thing about what it's not actually the. So while the judges said that about that. So sorry, I'm gonna. You can edit this.
No, that's all good.
Yeah, it's a good thing about it, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay. So, like in terms of in-flight charters, for example, you've said the judge says you can't hand over health and safety obligations because it was a face that torn a lot more than a booking agent. The genesis to that, though, is that you can't contract out of your health and safety duties. Full stop.
Yes.
And because it was the face of the tour, it was more than a booking agent. In fact, they were the only agent doing the tours to the island. And one of their failures was actually not providing enough information to people about the risks associated with going on those tours so that they could make a decision for themselves whether they actually wanted to go on the tour or not.
Right.
So when you look at that, because initially I was like, well, this is, great, but these charges all seem a bit weird. And I think when we first talked about it, we went, well, what's going on here? Why is that the case? But that actually makes sense to me when it comes down to it. That not only and not because what had happened was in-flight had actually said, well, we rely on our subcontractors, the people that are doing the flights, etc., to actually manage the risks. And what the court's saying is, no, you can't, and you couldn't. And this is about the sort of influence and control stuff, about the Section 30 duty, and also when you look at Section 22 of what's reasonably practicable, and that who has the most influence and control. So I think that what I can glean from looking at in-flight charters, and they've sort of said, well, we relied on everybody else, etc., is that at some point somebody made a decision that in-flight charters was not actually liable or captured by the Section 34 duty.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that their responsibilities in terms of health and safety were limited to ticketing and people coming in and out of their shop. So it probably was slips, trips, and falls.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're probably thinking
Right?
the greatest risk is a paper cut.
And all of those things. So that's why there's nothing there. There's nothing around the actual conducting of these tours, etc., because it completely was off the radar.
Yeah.
Now the case sort of suggests that there was nothing in place at all.
Yep.
And then you go, well, root cause analysis, how did this happen? Well, somebody at some point actually decided that they that they didn't have any obligations in respect to the people that went on the tours, the Section 36.2 duty, that they completely carved that out. So then I go, well, how does that happen? And then I think, well, first off, somebody made an assumption when they actually did their hazard and risk assessment, Section 30 hazard and risk assessment, and worked out the appropriate controls. Most likely nobody double-checked that or whatever. Assumptions were made, and those assumptions went on for years, for the number of years that they conducted the tours under the Act. So what do I say to people? Well, one, if these are really high risk arising from work, and you might have a blind spot to this too, arising out of your activities, etc., then you need to get good advice. And it might be that your health and safety manager is not the right person for this.
Yeah.
I saw this in the Tally's case about the listeria and the managing of guarding risk and the two duties in respect of having to keep sanitation and cleanliness done for MPI standards and the RMP,
Mm-hmm.
and then also the health and safety and guarding issue
Mm-hmm.
as well, and
Yeah.
then making a call to remove guarding because they considered that it increased the listeria risk.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that were harmed then were collateral damage. So that's a case that I did, and it was an appeal of a prohibition notice and upheld by the court, improvement notice upheld by the court. But the issue there was that this assumption had been made that the greater risk to the world was actually listeria, and that you'd manage the risk in relation to guarding and being trapped in nip points by actually not having a sign up and telling people not to put their hands in. So when you make those assumptions, they've got a snowball effect. So you want to make an assumption, that's fine, but get the right advice. And actually, these sort of things require both legal and legal advice about how the Act actually applies in respect of you and in respect of your activities, and also advice about how you then manage the risks, etc. Because you don't get down to the risks until you see whether you've got a duty. And some of the hard thing about the Section 34 duty, for example, is actually working out whether or not you've got a same or similar duty as somebody else.
This is really interesting. I'm just, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the ISO 45001 standard, where at the very beginning of that management system, it speaks to the importance of having the stakeholder register of both the upstream and downstream PCBUs, and anyone who is impacted, whether positive or negatively, by your operations. And it's a register that I've introduced to businesses of all shapes and sizes, and it's not too uncommon to have pushback on that particular document, because businesses are like, why do we need this register? This feels
same with the legal risk register that ISO says about too, and I say, well, we need to do a legal risk register for you, and they go, why?
Yes.
And then I'm like, well, how do you know when your trigger points are that you need to go get legal advice, or you are actually in a space where there's actually a higher risk? So you need to notify your insurer, or you need to do various things
And so for us, it seems quite obvious, but it also feels like it's not so obvious to your average business owner or officer or director of a board. I think it's so critical, and it's such potentially a simple thing to do.
Really, really simple and really transparent and clear. And it takes some of the risk out of those assumptions being made too, because somebody who's got legal expertise, or somebody who's got risk management expertise, has actually looked at those risks and has actually given a weighting to them for you, so that you don't actually get it wrong. Because like the problem with health and safety law, it's a problem. It's a great thing, and it's also a problem. And people don't like it when I categorize it like this, but it is like tax a little bit too. You see, it's a voluntary compliance regime. Now, people will think, oh, I'm saying I can voluntarily comply with it or not. No, actually, you get to choose how you implement the regime. It's Robin's law. So you need to consider your enterprise and what you do, and ensure that you comply with it. Just like tax, if you misinterpret the tax law, etc., then you're in trouble for penalties. Well, just like this here, the problem is that people can die as well if you get it wrong, and the fines are very, very high. So you've got to consider your enterprise, what you do, and you've got to ensure that you comply with all relevant duties. And you've got your Section 22 considerations too, and you must always consider who has the most influence and control in that scenario, whether you're in a Section 34 consult, coordinate, cooperate space, or whether you're just actually managing things between your different work groups, etc., and all the rest. But you still have who has the most influence and control. And also, don't blindly rely on others. Even if you're a principal, you've got to ensure that you know and understand how other businesses run, and what their control measures and that they have in place are.
Mhm.
and fight them if you think that they've got it wrong.
Mm.
No, our workers aren't coming there because you actually don't have the right things in place.
Yes. Yeah.
The number of people, and you probably hear this too, number
Mhm.
of people that say to me, well, I can't make them do anything. I'm like, you have a contract with them,
Yes.
you set the rules.
Yep.
And when we get down to your next sort of questions,
Mm.
I'll sort of explain one of the practical things that I think is actually having a schedule to your contract with that person that sets
Mm.
out your Section 34 duties and what you agree on.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, and maybe
Which
trigger
I
points. Mm.
used that during COVID. I think when
Mm.
we had one of our first discussions, I said,
Yeah.
I'm doing variations to contracts where I'm actually setting out what the COVID controls and that are
Mm.
and what the steps are that need
Yep.
to be taken, and that the workers of the entity could actually
Yep.
say, I step down from doing work, just like your own employee could do to you
Yep.
until such time as you fix this,
Yep.
and that it won't be a breach of the contract to actually
Mm.
do that.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
that's really brilliant advice. Again, I'm just thinking of some of the other industries I work with quite a lot, particularly in, well, one obvious one is the construction side of things, but also in recruitment and temp agencies, where often when I speak with recruitment companies, um, many of them seem to feel like they do not have that much power when it comes to who they are engaging with and who they're sending their temp workers to. And it's like, it's in the contract, like enforce your contract. That's
Well,
where all the power is, right?
absolutely.
Mm.
And the other thing is that, no, don't forget that some of the most serious prosecutions, like the Enviro waste one in Wellington with the young
Mm.
man that got hung in a glass
Mm. Mm.
collection
Yes.
bin, he was supplied labour from a
Mm.
recruitment agency.
Mm.
He ended up being an employee, but he'd been, there was this connection between being the supplied labour,
Mm.
getting the HT license while being supplied labour, and all the rest in that. Um, you always have influence and control
Yeah.
because you can choose not to send your staff there if you
Mm.
don't want to send your staff there.
Mhm.
I get it. I do work for recruitment agencies and that too, and I get it that labour supply and that is quite a finely nuanced
Mm.
um, industry.
Yeah.
But having said that, if you set the rules up right and you make sure that it's very clear from the outset what your rules are and that you will, the reasons why you'll say, no, we won't send people to that work site, etc.
Mhm.
There's so many opportunities to just actually use really good processes to
Mm.
ensure that things like induction and that are done well.
Mhm.
You know, um, I've always been a proponent of online inductions where you actually answer all the questions and
Mm.
you take photos of your certification and all that sort of thing.
Mhm.
And you're not even allowed that piece of plant in the site unless it's actually certified and appropriate,
Mm.
and that you've cited the licenses of people that are going to be using it.
Yeah. 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 So you've
So
got.
easy to do that,
Mm.
and you have it set up so you answer all of that
Mm.
well in advance of going to the site.
Yep.
And yeah, because the number of times I've had to actually advise people of how to get plant off a site that's actually
Mm.
non-compliant,
Mm. Yeah, and
and
yeah,
make sure that it can't be used
yeah,
and stand it down and all the rest.
yeah, which is really timely and expensive. And again, I'm thinking of my own experiences of talking with site managers and supervisors who are absolutely stretched to the max anyway, having to manage people, workers who have turned up to site who are not qualified or do not have the right documentation to be there, and they're expected to deal with that while still trying to manage an extremely busy site.
Yeah, so you just
All the
don't let them in, and
Mm.
and you have it set up that they get flagged if they haven't
Mm.
done their induction, and then you just say goodbye, see ya.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Goodbye. No, turn around that piece of plant. It's
Mm.
not,
Yeah. So
and they
again,
get a notification that they haven't done their induction
mm.
within 24 hours of coming to the site. You're not permitted on the site until
Yeah.
such time as that's rectified.
Yeah, so it takes away any of the headache or guesswork. Really boils back to the systems and sticking to the plan, right?
Oh yeah, and also just recognizing areas of conflict for your staff.
Mm.
That actually that's also managing psychosocial harm.
Yeah, that's a great
That,
point.
you don't put them in
Really
a
good point.
situation where they've got a big burly crane driver that says, I'm going to
Yeah,
smash your head in because I'm not allowed
yeah,
on the
that's
site.
exactly right. And I'm sure there's a lot of health and safety managers, coordinators, advisors out there that have all experienced that, and probably dread the time of the day when they have to do that site walkthrough, knowing that they're going to have those challenging conversations, which could all be avoided. Yeah,
If the right things were in place in the first
yeah,
place.
yeah.
And then they were backed up by their employer
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
and the board, the employer
Mm,
and the board, that,
mhm,
yeah, we just don't tolerate that stuff.
yeah,
Don't tolerate violence in any way, shape, or form. Don't
mhm,
tolerate abuse of our staff. You'll be sending somebody else to drive that crane because we're not having that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you.
Kind of sideways, but it kind
Yeah,
of,
but
you know,
it all kind of comes full circle, doesn't it? It's
yeah, yeah. I mean, and if we come back to
mhm.
them, and we've also got GNS as well.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just actually being aware of, like, with GNS,
mm,
they pled guilty to the charges,
yeah.
and
So that was back in May. So, and that related to that they had multiple trips, right? So they had sent multiple members of their team onto Fakari, um, uh, days, weeks, months leading up to the event. But then there was also the additional complication of the pilots of the helicopters that were taking their people out into the to the island as well. So, in terms of that, I mean, it was a pretty hefty fine. They could be facing a really hefty fine still.
yeah, the starting point
Mm,
for in-flight
yeah.
was 400,000.
Mm,
That's what was proffered up by
hmm
WorkSafe, and um, the judge said, and they put it in a medium culpability because actually none of the in-flight's people were there on the day of the incident, which is analogous to GNS too. None of them were there, so that
yeah.
it put it down in the medium culpability with a starting point of 400,000,
Yeah. Mm,
um, and um, so that maybe gives an indication of where GNS might start.
yeah.
Then GNS sort of argued, well, they relied on other people, etc., and they, relied on other people to have the right controls and that
Mm,
in place.
yeah.
The judge had a little bit of sympathy for it, but not much, so reduced the starting point down.
hmm
The end fine after reductions, and you generally get about health and safety cases, if you plead guilty early, it can be up to about 50% reduction, taking into account remorse and various other things.
Yep.
So the fine ended up at 227,500,
hmm
and they were ordered to pay prosecution costs. There was no reparation because no one was harmed.
Yes.
Thank
Right.
goodness. Yeah.
Mm,
So again, no one harmed. I don't know what the mitigating or aggravating factors will be,
mm,
and I don't know how the court will assess
mm,
what was reasonably practicable.
yep.
At sentencing, that still, even though they plead guilty, that still gets sort of challenged a little bit by defence counsel about really what was reasonably practical. And yes, they've agreed to the summary of facts, and
Yeah.
the prosecutors from WorkSafe will push back and say you agreed to that and what the practicable steps were.
Mm,
I think that they could argue, have arguments around the effectiveness or all of those things. But when it comes down to it, you're probably looking at a similar fine, and it's again up to the judge to what in-flight maybe got.
mm. Yeah, yeah, and again, it's we're still in this kind of wait and see situation at the moment. Um, I mean, it's fascinating to watch, and I suspect that it will have quite meaningful implications and applications for how businesses operate moving forward. And hopefully it's going, and you've already mentioned or alluded to the fact that you're being asked to assist boards and officers in ensuring that they've got their risk management systems aligned and suitable to
Yeah,
their
I mean,
level.
what I would say is, and I'm always sort of cautious about cases where
Mm,
people plead guilty, and you
mm,
do see comment on this,
mhm.
and I've definitely said this in my Westlaw
Yeah.
health and safety law updates,
Hmm.
that where someone pleads guilty,
Mm,
there's not a real testing of the practicable steps, etc. There's not sort of expert evidence called and being
mm,
challenged, and the court comes to a conclusion on whether what the right steps, etc. were. A good example where there's a full trial, and then they look at all of that was corrections, and they looked at all of the various steps that should have been taken and
mm,
whether or not they were reasonably practicable. And
yeah.
I was a prosecutor on that, and we were lucky because we actually got home on every single one of our practicable steps. But
Mm,
there's also a risk to the regulator that they come up with what they think is reasonably practicable steps,
mm,
and it's like a list of things that they think that they should have done. And yes, there's experts that sort of back those up, etc.
mm,
But they're not really challenged when you plead guilty. So,
mm,
and what's challenged is that you come into an agreement on a summary of facts of what you could agree on for the
mm,
purposes of sentencing. So that's my caution around looking at sort of
mm,
sentencing notes where they've pled guilty is, yes, you can probably take that as being reasonably practicable steps, and they're informed by
mm,
WorkSafe's assessment and investigation, but they're also ring fenced to the circumstances in which they fall in as
mm.
well.
Okay.
So even if you run the same or similar enterprise, you can use them as a baseline, but you
Mm,
shouldn't actually use them as a definitive list.
sure. Yeah. So they're useful, but with caution.
Yeah,
Mm,
nothing, that, but then there's nothing better than learning from the mistakes of other
mm,
people in order to try and avoid them in the future. So,
yeah.
you know, I recommend taking the sentencing notes in your business. If you've got one that's same or similar to a case where they're being either convicted or sentenced,
Mhm,
then use them as a toolbox talking thing. I say to people, get one of your staff members to present on one of these cases once a month or
mm,
something,
mm,
um, and then they learn all about it. Then they come and tell your guys all about it, and they don't just hear the voice of the health and safety
mm,
expert or the employment lawyer that deals with your staff. They
mm,
actually hear their own voices on it.
yeah.
And, have your health and safety person there that they can answer questions about it and that. But
Mm,
it should be an iterative discussion. You should actually keep people up to date with health and safety, what's happening.
mm, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You, it's a good way of actually embedding sort of those things in the workplace. And
Hmm.
one of the things I've observed is the entity itself, often because they're in shock, etc., and they do take it seriously and they make changes, and they make changes because they want to also show the court when they're prosecuted
Mm,
that they actually have learnt their lessons and all the rest in that.
mhm,
But I do think that the people that learn the most lessons about a health and safety prosecution are actually the people not in the entity itself but outside of it that
mm,
actually show interest in it and think, how does that apply to us? And what would happen if we were in the same circumstance, and
mm.
would we have done the same things? Um, yeah, not
Yeah.
all of them are sort of the Darwin Awards. A lot
Mm,
of them are actually people meaning to do well. And in my experience, a lot of incidents of workers actually being really diligent and trying to work really hard and do their best with their employer,
mhm,
and make the wrong decision at the wrong time. Like,
mm, mm,
something's trapped in a machine, and so they, don't do the shut off properly, and the lockout,
mhm,
and then they go and reach in, and then the next thing they've lost their fingers,
mm.
and they're
Yeah.
not safe by position and that. But then you look at them too, and you go, that I can see how that happened,
Mm,
and lack of training and lack of the right things in place and the lack of engineering controls and all the rest in that. So
mm. Yeah, but I guess the difference is, and it's vast, between the business that's proactive and is actively going out to try and identify any unforeseen risk and managing it versus the business that's just got the blinkers on and it's, see no evil, hear no evil approach, right?
Well, number ones, you probably hear this too. I've had some businesses say to me, we know that our workers use drugs, but I can't get anyone else to do that work.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, right, really?
Yeah, is that the benchmark? Is that the standard you're prepared to stand by? It's frightening.
Yeah, like, you sure?
Mm.
And when you talk to them about, well, are your workers good workers? And they're like, yeah, they're really, really good workers. Well, then would you invest in them and actually helping them get clean?
Yeah, no, you're right. I've certainly had those conversations. Thankfully, in the past, customers in my early days of being a consultant, where I didn't really have the luxury of choosing what businesses I was working with, it was almost a trade-off. It was like, well, we've got the work, the market is sparse, so we just have to take whoever we can get our hands on. It's quite frightening, really.
Yeah, but forestry could have said that years ago, and now they've got people that are like 2-3 years clean, that they're tested, that they're proud of it, that they have badges on the top of their jacket that say 1, 2, 3 years, and they are really proud of that.
Yep.
And so it's actually just probably the innovation team at WorkSafe would talk about that too, that kind of gameology kind of thing of getting
huge.
people connected, that they see some benefit from it, that they get a bonus or whatever if they're actually at the end of that year they've been sober and not caught out with drug tests and all the rest in that.
Yeah. Attention project management and construction business owners and health and safety professionals. Are you seeking expert guidance to streamline your health and safety processes? Look no further than Advanced Safety, New Zealand's leading health and safety consultancy. Our team specialises in comprehensive capability assessments, tailored systems, exceptional training and ongoing support. We're here to simplify your journey, ensuring you achieve demonstrable legal compliance efficiently. And here's the best part. With Advanced Safety, you're guaranteed results. We commit to achieving compliance within 180 days or less, providing you with peace of mind and saving you valuable time and resources. Say farewell to intricate procedures and welcome simplicity. Our experts excel at simplifying health and safety, empowering you to focus on your core business operations. To explore our franchise opportunities for health and safety professionals and our comprehensive suite of solutions for construction and project management companies, visit advancedsafety.co.nz today. Advanced Safety, simplifying health and safety for New Zealand businesses. That's a great example too. The gamification of safety outcomes is it's so powerful. It's great stuff. So before we move on from Fukari, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the health and safety breaches that were tabled against the Fukari White Island owners that was led up to the eruption in 2019. So they attempted to have those charges thrown out. The charges remain, but they've been narrowed. I just wondered if you could speak to that in terms of what that may mean, or what we could potentially take away from that.
Yeah, what I'd say is what it will do. So I want to be a bit careful because this is court's jurisdiction. But it will now have narrowed also the evidential focus in terms of how the case is presented and what submissions are made and what's said about what they actually can and can't do. So it will have changed. That narrowing will have changed the theory of the case and the prosecution case. They'll be limited in what they can bring in and what they can't. It's going to be very much focused on that narrowed scope. So that will change the course of the prosecution. So while it seems like they had a loss, they had a bit of a win as well in terms of now it's quite narrowed. The other thing about narrowing it is also narrows down culpability in that if it's depending on how much it's narrowed, and about the influence and control and what was required to be done. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's probably as much as I'd say about
Yeah. Okay,
that.
thank you. No, I appreciate that. That's yeah. It's something. It's a question I wanted to ask.
Yeah,
So
you had I see you missed it one. So you
okay.
had a question also about overlapping duties.
Oh, I did too. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So okay. So all right. So perhaps before we move on, I was hoping you might be able to just provide a little bit more insight, a little bit more of your thoughts on the complexities of the overlapping duties in health and safety. I mean, we've kind of talked to this at some length. However, from your experience, when it comes to overlapping duty holders, what are some of the best practices? What are some of the things that we should all be thinking about? What are some of your insights?
Okay, well, so the first thing is I think that we should move away from calling it complex or saying there's complexities, because actually people
Mm,
make it much more complex than it needs to be, because I don't think it is complex.
mhm,
But I do think that organisations mistakenly believe that they're not captured or they fail to address that Section 34 duty, particularly in relation to the upstream duty. So when
mhm,
they're the principal or they're an entity that actually controls or sets up the whole parameters of everybody working together or brings them together. So you might be an event coordinator that brings
mm,
in, for
yeah.
a music festival,
Mhm,
and brings in electricians and plumbers and people with portaloos and all of that stuff and this
mhm,
infrastructure.
mhm,
Um, it would be completely wrong to say that you don't have a Section 34 duty. You
mm,
absolutely do.
yep.
So, if we take them for example, and we look at about that sort of thing, um, the duty is not too difficult.
Mhm,
And actually, WorkSafe's got some incredibly good guidance, as you know, Matt, about
yes.
overlapping duties and the questions to ask each other
Mm,
and the information to exchange and all the rest. I think it's well worth getting yourself up to speed with
mm,
that. But
yep.
the gist of that, I guess, this is, well, first question you ask yourself is, well, do we have a duty that's same or similar as another PCBU in relation to the workplace, our employees, contractors, or the general public?
Mm, yep.
That's actually not that easy a question. And
Mm,
even lawyers like me get my head a bit sort of screwed up about, because, but the main one that you need to look at is, do we have a Section 36 duty?
mhm, yeah.
Um, And in relation to other persons, it's nuanced a bit. So if you come down to 36.2, so we're talking about the
Mhm,
vicarious situation
yep.
with in-flight or the battles, etc.
Mm,
Um, then in terms of 36.2, it's arising out of the work.
mhm, yep.
So that's the parameters around it.
Mm,
So then you've got to look at, well, what work's being done that
mhm,
puts me in this with another PCBU as well, and neither one of you can contract out of your duties,
mhm,
and you actually might also share the exact same duty, and you still actually have to discharge them. Each of you has to discharge them in your own right,
mhm,
but then you've got this connecting factor of you both got the same duty. So what are you meant to do?
mm,
If you're really unsure about that, this is like the same thing as we said about in-flight and about
mhm,
GNS.
yeah.
Don't make an assumption
Mm,
that you're not captured. You'd be safer to make the assumption that you are captured and then
yeah.
actually do it anyway.
Mm,
And so, what would you need to do? Well, of course, you need to consult, coordinate, and cooperate with one another. But really, what does that mean,
mhm,
right? Well, you've got to discuss the risks in the workplace and the likelihood of harm and the way that the work would be conducted, or the way that because there's a synergism sometimes too, that one entity's work actually then combined with the other entity's work creates other risks.
mhm,
So that's why you've got to coordinate with each other.
yeah.
In terms of the risks to the general public, like under 36.2 duty, they might not actually be that clear to you,
Mhm,
and you can get a bit stupid too. Like you can sort of try and put cotton wool around the entire world and fill every hole in the Swiss cheese, but that's not what the law requires you to do. It's all reasonably practicable steps, but you've got to do something. You can't do nothing.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
you know,
Mhm.
it starts with a discussion, and you actually might discuss with each other in order to actually work out whether you do have same or similar duties,
Mhm.
about actually what you do, how you do it, what implications the work has, what risks you see that there are in your work, and then you look and see whether they dovetail over each other. So that's the first discussion.
Yeah.
And then you can always go get some legal advice from someone like me, or risk assessment advice about whether or not you know, because you get their policies and that in too, and you get their procedures and you get their JSAs,
Mm.
and you know, it's well within your rights to actually have your expert check theirs out and see whether they've got it right.
Mm.
Don't just rely on them that they've got it right, particularly if your workers are going to be put at risk of being actually
Mm.
in the space where their people are working. A good example was, are their traffic management plans effective and appropriate because my guys are going to be coming into the
Mhm.
same area as them? There's a number of prosecution cases where that's happened, where someone's been harmed because they're relying on the
Mm.
traffic management plan of another entity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you're making those assumptions that people have got things right could be actually quite dangerous for your workers. And so you might want someone who actually knows about traffic management plans just to have a quick look over it and give you a
Mm.
once over, and then you fight back on some things, or you say, well, if we're going to do this work together in the same environment,
Mhm.
then what we're going to need is some tweaks to your traffic management plan.
Mm. Yeah. Fantastic.
You've got to talk with them about the likelihood of harm as well. So, what actual harm, what risk is there of harm,
Mhm.
and in what ways could people be harmed? You've got to talk about what controls are to be implemented and have that discussion about whether or not you agree with them about the controls, or whether you've actually got better controls than they do about managing that thing, and whether they should adopt yours. Those sort of discussions are generally helpful, or they actually create brainstorming where the two of you come up with actually a whole new thing, because actually you worked out that the synergism between each other's work, or the increased risk because of having an electrician working around somebody that's working at height and all the rest, and the likelihood of things being dropped, or
Mm.
various other things. Or that actually we would be better to coordinate so that the guys putting up the scaffolding aren't doing it with other people around.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Cool.
all of that stuff
Yeah.
comes out, and that's why this duty exists, because this is
Mm.
where the health and safety, really meaty, good conversation should be happening.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the key takeaways, right? Is what this is all about is generating good quality conversation. So the option of choosing to not do anything is actually not an option at all. So it comes back to the three C's, right? So the coordinating, collaboration, cooperation with the other parties that are impacted, affected, or a part of your business operations. And then testing. So not relying on assumption that the plans that have been written on the piece of paper are actually either in practice or suitable for managing the risks that have been tabled, right?
And the other thing is, pre-contracting conversations, pre-qualification, asking to see their compliance history, asking to, if they haven't had incidents, asking them what they learned from them and what they've now changed and implemented. I mean, I don't think you should strike someone out just because they've had an incident or a prosecution for WorkSafe necessarily, but you would want to know that they've now changed things in their organisation. And because there are some entities that there's very limited people that you can choose to engage with. If you look at the waste management industry, for example, you're quite limited in the players there.
Mm.
So you still just want to make sure that the right things are being done.
Yep.
And also, there's other stuff to talk about too. There's things like how will we manage an emergency? Who will report to WorkSafe if there's an accident? Who has a responsibility?
Mm.
Um, you know, Who
it's
will call
really
the
common.
police and deal with the police and all the rest? Who will deal with the fire? If
Mm,
you've got has no,
mhm,
who are your certified handlers? Who are dealing with that? How are they going to keep my
mm,
people safe and have separation distances and all of those things? If you're engaging with an entity that does stuff that you've never done before, like has a responsibility for has no,
mm,
then you'd want them to explain everything that they have in place in relation to that and what they would do. If you're sharing a warehouse with somebody and they have hazardous substances in there, then what specific training are they going to give to your people about hazardous substances and emergencies and all the rest?
yeah, yeah, it's brilliant. And again, that's a really common finding that me and the team discover is around emergency response planning. In particular, who is going to notify WorkSafe of notifiable events and incidents. It's often left to assumption. And frighteningly, I suspect there are many instances where a notifiable event perhaps hasn't been notified, purely because there's that breakdown of communication between the parties. So, yeah, it's extremely.
One assumes that the other one has done it. Uh, the other thing is, what's your plan if someone's injured? Are you going to call an
Mm,
ambulance? You're going to drive them to
mm,
White Cross or whatever? My recommendation is don't drive them to White Cross. I've
mm,
ended up arguing as a prosecutor that the emotional harm was higher because they
mm,
piled someone into a car
yeah,
and and they'd been degloved and they were in pain, where you can get an ambulance there and they'll give them gas
yeah, of
and
course. Yeah.
and have them comfortable for transit to the hospital.
Mm,
And if you take them to the White Cross and they actually need to go to the hospital, that's another whole trip and a
mm,
delayed pain relief.
yeah.
So, just stuff like that where you end up thinking you're doing the right thing and you do it wrong. So
Mm,
actually having that discussed, what is the plan? What do we do?
mm.
Always call the ambulance. Always call the ambulance.
Well, that's right. That's what they're there for, right? Yeah, but and again, it's not leaving things to assumption. It's not, certainly not suggesting that everything has to be thought through to the nth degree. It's just, okay, what do we have to consider? And there's frameworks around this. I mean, the Health and Safety at Work Act is certainly part of that. But I mean, there's the ISO standards. There's other good practice guidance material out there to help
And
businesses navigate this.
And
Um,
people like Red Cross and
mm,
Fins and that they give really good advice about how to
yeah.
manage first aid incidents and how to deal with things, etc. appropriately.
Mm, yeah.
Um, yeah, there's kind of no excuse not to know that stuff
Mm,
and have that coordinated on the site.
yeah.
I mean, identifying who the first aiders are, in your crew and the other side in their crew, and actually
Mm,
that gives you more first aiders if you actually have worked out
mm,
who's what, and
yeah.
and coordinating work so that you always have a cover for a first aider or people in the area in the vicinity, that it doesn't take them long to get to somewhere if
Yeah.
someone's injured.
Yeah, and I suspect it's safe to say that this conversation we'll have again, probably in weeks and months to come, once the Fakari court cases come to their conclusion. Because I suspect a lot of the discussion will be around the emergency planning and the management of that, or potentially lack of. But
I think it
again,
may not be actually.
oh really?
Looking at the other changes, and I'm
Mm,
I'm being careful.
yeah, of course.
Um, it, I mean, health and safety charges always look backwards about what
Yep.
you could have put in place,
Hmm.
but and there are about around the risk assessment in terms of monitoring alert levels and all
Mm,
the rest in that. Um, and ensuring that they had the most up-to-date data and
mm,
making dynamic risk assessment decisions, which I think I talked about when we first talked about this.
yes.
That it struck me that things like changes in the pool colour and all of the rest, and that
Mm,
changes on conditions on the island should have initiated that kind of gut feeling of something's not
mm,
right here, and then steps to be taken.
hmm.
Um, so yeah, in the news already, the evidence in relation to how GNS actually does the
Mm, hmm.
does the alert levels and
Yeah.
considers them. It's quite alarming if you think about it, that it's a
Yes.
voting exercise.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's not inspiring, really, is it?
No,
Mm.
no, but it's not unusual in the scientific community to have this
Mm.
deference for one another's opinions and
Mm.
that, but in this sort of environment, it's slightly concerning. But
Mm.
yeah, and the court will make what it does of that stuff,
Mm.
no doubt,
Yeah.
and we'll consider, the validity of that and who was relying on it and what the problems were with it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's just flipping it up a little bit. Over the last couple of weeks, there was a case that certainly caught my attention, and I know it caught many others as well, is in regards to a family's private prosecution in regards to their son's lifelong eye injury that he sustained whilst using a slingshot during a school planned excursion. Um, I was led to believe that this was quite an unusual circumstance where it was a private prosecution in reference to the Health and Safety at Work Act. But it seems that may not necessarily be the case, that it's not so rare.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, they're not every day,
Mm.
but there have been cases. And in fact, I just, backtracking on this incident too,
Mm.
there was a similar case where WorkSafe actually investigated,
Mm-hmm.
but they didn't, unlike this, where they didn't investigate.
Mm.
And they didn't file charges, and they were taken to task by the
Mm.
mother of a 13-year-old
Yeah.
girl who was injured and fractured her pelvis, etc.,
Mm.
in a climbing incident. And the reason that WorkSafe was taken to task was that they'd actually prosecuted Ferg's kayaks for the same kind of incident with a
Right.
carabiner. And that resulted in a review by WorkSafe of the investigation and the conclusions, and a determination that a prosecution should have been taken, and an apology to the mother and daughter.
Yeah.
So what I would say as background to this discussion about this is that has happened before, sadly.
Yes. Okay.
In this instance, it wasn't triaged out to the investigation team. Instead, it was shut down at that triaging level, clearly based on the newspaper reports and what they said. So,
Okay. Interesting.
So maybe it would be helpful if I sort of explain the circumstances in which you can actually do a private prosecution.
Yeah, please.
And we'll start there. Yeah. So under Section 144 of HASWA, there's the ability to take a private prosecution, and you can do that when the regulator could not or chooses not to prosecute a work health and safety incident or breaches.
Yep.
In addition, if no investigation is initiated, then a private prosecution is still open. There's also another incident, and this is where a lot of families, because you've got 12 months, WorkSafe's got 12 months to lay charges, and you've got an additional period of time, which I'll cover off shortly, that allows you to take a private prosecution also once WorkSafe's made that determination. But as we all know, quite often WorkSafe makes the determination like right down to just about the 12-month mark.
Yes.
The other instance that you can take a private prosecution is when the coroner completes and signs a certificate of findings, and they indicate that there's a health and safety breach.
Okay.
So you get this kind of second stab at it. So you were saying it's a bit rare. Well, there's a few cases where it's actually been taken, and they've been filed under sections 36.1 or 36.2 of HASWA. The examples are New Zealand Meat Workers Union and South Pacific Meats, and that was in 2012. That was under the Health and Safety at and employment
Yes.
legislation, and Cregan and New Zealand Defence Force likewise under the old legislation. Helen Kelly and Puketi logging, 2015. So that was just on the fringes of the new
Yeah, that's right. That rings a
legislation.
bell. Yep, I remember that. Yep.
Helen Kelly and M&A Cross Rotorua, again, 2014 under the old legislation. Casey and the University of Otago. Now, that was an interesting one where the University of Otago had an issue with people slipping over and breaking bones, etc. And they actually, WorkSafe had been advised of it. Nothing was really done. It got to maximum saturation, and Ms. Casey broke her leg, I think. There's severe fractures.
Yeah.
And it was at maximum point where they ought to have known, and they ought to reasonably have known that there was a significant risk about this slippery concrete, etc., and that people were likely to be harmed.
Yeah.
And Ms. Casey was represented by now Victoria Casey, KC, and there was a successful prosecution against the University of Otago. So there was also another one in relation to a forestry prosecution that WorkSafe had filed charges, but it was actually 1 day out of time due to a miscalculation.
Right.
And then what they did was they offered compensation to the family, and the family then went and took a private prosecution and were successful.
Okay.
So, and in that instance, WorkSafe provided them with all their charging documents, their whole investigation, etc.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
So what WorkSafe says about private prosecutions is, and I think this is important to bear in mind, that they say on their website, we value private prosecutions as an important tool in the work and health and safety system. They provide an opportunity for victims, their families, and other parties to take a prosecution when WorkSafe does not. Now, they also say on their website that they'll provide reasonable assistance and help to people with a private prosecution. So if they've investigated, you can actually ask under the Official Information Act, Privacy Act, etc., for their file and their investigation.
Yep.
It's a bit more difficult if they haven't investigated, because basically you're going to have to investigate the incident yourself.
Yep.
And that will cost money.
Yep.
And as will the prosecution itself, and I'll talk a bit more about sort of some of the fish hooks around a private prosecution.
Yeah, because I imagine for many it would be cost prohibitive, right?
It is pretty much. If it's a fatality, what I recommend to people is that really participate quite strongly in, if there's a coronial inquest, in the coronial inquest, and push to say that there have been breaches and that, so that it opens up and WorkSafe gets another 6 months to actually put together the charges and file if they consider that there's been a breach, and that it's the best bang for your money, and you kind of ride alongside everybody else that's in the coronial inquest. But it's really expensive. It would be potentially 100,000, and then you've got experts as well, depending what you're doing. And then you got to, and then and then if it's a fatality, you may get up to about 200 and something thousand in reparation, but you've got to think about that costs in criminal cases only allow really for about 60% of your costs coming back to you. It's actually very finely balanced. I acted on one before, and it's definitely.
And
we'll talk a bit more about why people do them, because sometimes it's actually not about money at all.
No, of course.
And I think you'd have to be like that. So who can take one? Well, you have to notify WorkSafe that you're an interested person, and then you get notified by WorkSafe that they are not taking any actions.
Okay.
And once you've registered your interest, and once you've received notification that action is no action has been taken, you can apply to the district court for leave to file charges.
Yeah.
Some people, it's sort of a bit nuanced the way that legislation under the Crimes Act and the Criminal Procedure Act sort of works, but the basic rule of thumb, the gold standard about how you're meant to do it is you're actually meant to file all your evidence and that into court and have the court, a judge, consider whether or not the charges should proceed. In practice, some people do just file their charges and the registrar accepts them and that, but then you're actually not got that certainty that they've actually been accepted as being a valid private prosecution. So that wouldn't be the methodology that I would suggest that you do, because they're then up for challenge later and that would cost you more money unless you get a bit of an assessment, that you've got a prima facie case that you're at first sight that you've actually got a valid private prosecution. So you got so charges must be filed within the following time frames. 2 years after the date on which the incident occurred, situation or set of circumstances to which the offence related first became known to WorkSafe, or to reasonably have not become known to WorkSafe. 6 months after the date on which the coroner completes or signs a certificate of findings, or the proceeding or require from the proceeding or an inquiry that an offence has been committed under the Act. 3 months after the expiry date of an extension time granted to WorkSafe to make a decision to prosecute, so they can get, in some instances, up to another year to actually do the investigation. So with Vicari, they got an extension. I think they got an extension of time. They definitely did with Pike River. So that's something to bear in mind. Sure. If an enforceable undertaking has been given in relation to an offence, then it's 6 months after either the enforceable undertaking was contravened or it comes to WorkSafe's notice that the enforceable undertaking has been contravened. WorkSafe has agreed to withdraw the enforceable undertaking under Section 128 of the Act. So then that opens it up for private prosecution too. Okay. So how you go about getting information is that basically WorkSafe's position is that you request under the Official Information Act or the Privacy Act if it's your own stuff. And inspectors can actually be summoned to give evidence in the prosecution, and that happened in Puketi logging.
Okay, yep.
And they came and presented their investigation case and also were challenged about the mistakes that were made in their investigation or their decision making about why they didn't charge.
Yeah.
WorkSafe's policy is clear, though, that inspectors will be made available before and during the trial, so they actually have committed to that in writing. Okay. Private prosecutions have got to be commenced in accordance with the Criminal Procedure Act and rules. The Evidence Act has to be followed. The Criminal Disclosure Act has to be followed. So it's not really recommended, although you could establish that you might have standing to do it yourself, that you would actually do this yourself. I think you do need a lawyer to do it. And the charges have got to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. So that's quite a high standard.
Yes.
While there's strict liability, so once you've proven that it's been a breach, then you're strictly liable for that breach. There's no real defence as such other than that you took all reasonably practicable steps. But the issue is that you do have quite a high standard to prove. It's not the balance of probabilities, like more likely than not. With the civil one, it actually is beyond reasonable doubt, like you'd expect with all criminal cases.
Okay. So the threshold's that much higher. Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, that's right. But why would you take one? Well, the majority of private prosecutions are not motivated by money or the likely reparation that you can get. And if you're you'd be silly if you were going for a company and you think, I'm going to do this just to get reparation. If they don't have
Mm,
insurance, then they may turn around and say you don't actually have the money, and they prove that they're not financial, and then you've actually wasted all this money on that. So
yep.
that's definitely not the reason.
Mm,
They're actually motivated mostly by the need for denunciation and deterrence, and making sure that there's a change in health and safety behaviour for that particular PCBU.
yeah.
A good example is the Otago University case, where
Hmm.
they'd fallen in that area, like I said, where there'd been multiple people slipped
Yeah.
previously, suffering significant injuries. The university had failed to address it
Hmm.
and the issues relating to it, and wouldn't listen to the victim or any other people about that. So
Mm,
she initiated her own prosecution and was successful, and
mm,
its sentencing was awarded reparation.
hmm.
And there was also a declaration made by the court at sentencing of
Hmm.
what the practical steps were available based on the summary of facts. And this actually later formed a checklist for compliance for Otago
Ah,
University.
okay, that's a great
So,
one. Yeah.
you know,
Mm,
yeah.
mm,
However, even though I say that money's not the motivator, in
mm,
some circumstances,
mm,
there are other reasons too, and that's because you might want to prove that actually it was a work-related
mhm,
injury
mm,
and death, and that and I've had that happen before, and because otherwise ACC certain ACC payments aren't work-related injury. Death is different.
right, yes.
A work-related injury,
Yeah.
so that you actually get certain things in
Mm,
place for you that you didn't have before,
mhm,
in relation to ACC, and also so there's a number of other reasons why you might want to look at that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it strikes me as um, it's healthy democracy in a way, isn't it? So it's not relying solely on the regulator to get things right, to have the resource always to um, tackle every single case. And it's also just a recognition that at the end of the day, we're all human and sometimes we do get it wrong. And so this is an example of a fail-safe in a way. It's ensuring that people still have that opportunity to test it further if there is the evidence to suggest otherwise, right? Hmm.
However, um, there's been some cases where people have been quite gung ho, and
Mm,
legal counsel have filed charges in the context of an employment dispute, etc.,
mm,
against an employer on the basis that they believe that there's a causal connection between the
mm,
behaviour of the employer and what they did and didn't do,
mhm,
and the symptoms suffered by an employee.
mm,
Um, Without actually any proper expert evidence, like
mm.
sort of anecdotal evidence from a doctor, etc.
Sure.
Not evidence of the same level to get you beyond reasonable doubt, and certainly
Mm,
not credible enough in order to actually prove that charge and the causal connection between the thing
mm.
that they say caused the harm.
Yep.
Um, and in those instances, you really like filing that, you run the risk of costs and criminal cases being awarded against you, and
Mm.
not at the 60% level, but at the 100% level.
Oh wow. Gosh, not messing
Like,
around.
it might
Yeah.
be an argument for increased costs.
Mm.
Um, you
Yep.
know, yeah, and because the other thing is, prosecutors, when they file charges, are bound by the Crown Solicitor's prosecution guidelines,
Hmm.
and there's sort of they form a specific form of ethics around a prosecution and about evidential sufficiency, and taking into account matters relating to the offender and like their age and their
Mm-hmm.
circumstances and all the rest before you decide to file charges.
Mm.
And so the regulator sometimes can be criticised also for not having taken a prosecution, but there's a lot more that goes in to
Mm.
that, including an assessment of public interest. So, um, I don't know the circumstances around this case where they end up
Mm.
doing a private prosecution, or why
Yeah.
work so determined not to do it. But then I guess that kind of evidential sufficiency side of things doesn't actually happen until after you've done an investigation. So where I say here that, some of the issue here, I guess,
Yeah.
is that it's a triaging issue that WorkSafe,
Yeah.
when they decided not to prosecute, what did they consider? What were they looking at? What were they thinking? I mean, I can't, I haven't read, I'm going to confess, I haven't read the notes about the decision and judgment about finding them guilty. But what concerns me, I guess, from the news report is it does seem to be an oversight by the regulator and what I'm saying around the triaging. And one of the things that sort of deeply concerned me, if what they're saying in the newspaper article is correct, is that in its report, WorkSafe said Team Up Events blamed Grunfeld for his own injury, citing participant error because he glanced backward at a bungee at the moment it broke. And what I would say is that when I was a prosecutor at WorkSafe, one of the things that was, it was a position taken, it was also embedded in case law, is that a person or a worker shouldn't be blamed when there's actually inherent failures of the PCBU. And the concern about Team Up taking that view about the incident just shows that they had learned, they just didn't, their maturity around health and safety is very, very low.
Yes.
They clearly haven't reflected on the incident and they're clearly not remorseful. And that's what concerns me about it.
Yeah. It's an immediate response, right? It's kind of, for you and I that are well aware of root cause analysis, the importance of getting to the actual, the depth of how and why things like that happened. It's a red flag straight away because.
Well, and this must be from their investigation report that they're required to do under law, and they provide that to WorkSafe, and that's what they say in it. And I sort of think, how did that end up not being seen as a bit of a red flag? And then what's more, then according to the family, to Grunfeld, WorkSafe did not talk to Grunfeld about the injury and close its investigation into the incident without telling the family. And they have obligations under the Victims' Rights Act as well when they're, looking at things, etc. And this still would have been captured, in my view, under that, and meant that he was entitled to know about these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I come to the conclusion based on that, and without having read anything from WorkSafe and having done an official information request and having all the stuff myself, this is actually a triaging issue, and that it appears it was triaged out and not actually even referred to investigation. And that's why they didn't prosecute, because they didn't actually investigate.
Is that cause for concern, do you think?
Well, it is if what they say is true about their reason too, which is that they say WorkSafe didn't prosecute the company because it didn't consider that his injury was a permanent, life-changing injury. Now, that's actually not at investigation level, that's at triaging level. But it's not in keeping with WorkSafe's prosecution policy. It's also not in keeping with the Act that doesn't require harm for there to be a prosecution. So
if we put this particular case to the side just for a moment, is there are you aware of a formal review process when an event like this does occur, where it does go down the private prosecution road and it is successful? Is there a formal or informal review process back at WorkSafe to for lessons learned?
I'm not sure, because I haven't been there since 2014. I don't know what the position is now. I would hope that they would look at this and reflect on this. It may come as part of the family now taking them to task about not having prosecuted and now the costs that they've incurred.
Yeah.
That's actually a possibility that they could, these sort of things can also result in a judicial review and seeking costs against the regulator. It's not unheard of for people to do that where they've been put to having to deal with it themselves.
Yeah.
Um, and that's a discussion and a consideration for WorkSafe in terms of how they're going to deal with that particular family, or how they're going to manage the risks around that for themselves. And I wouldn't want to comment too much more on that, but that they are the risks that you run as a regulator. If you look at, like, I think we talked about GWRC and Adams.
Yes.
The consequences for the regulator in that instance when they tried to take enforcement activity in the Environment Court was not only did they have to pay the full costs of everybody, but they also had to pay $100,000 of the court's costs, which I think were 150 in total.
Yeah.
So they got away with only 50,000 not being paid, but they had to pay the court's cost of 100,000 as well.
Yeah.
And now the update on that is that Mr. Adams has now commenced civil proceedings against GWRC for his losses.
Oh wow, gosh! So there is a long tail to that case. Goodness.
And potentially more stuff in the future, which I can't comment on.
No, understand. It's just the importance of ensuring you got your facts straight before going down any particular roads.
I mean, like the problem is that lots of regulators don't actually look at what the mistakes of other regulators too, like the Tasman District Council. I think I mentioned that case as well about the swimming pool.
Yes.
And them granting consent for it, and then later turning around and saying, "Oh, when they were selling the house, no, you didn't have, should have been granted consent in that."
Yeah.
And them having to pay out, I think, about $275,000 in total losses, including emotional harm. It's a sober thing to prosecute people. It's a sober thing to take enforcement action, and it's a sober thing even just issuing a prohibition notice or an improvement notice. I was very aware as a prosecutor that how much you change somebody's landscape of their life, even a company's, by actually commencing a prosecution. And then it's a sober thing. It's a measured thing, and it needs to be done in accordance with the Crown Solicitor's prosecution guidelines and for the right reasons. It's also expensive. It's very, very expensive to take a prosecution. And if it's like 5 to 7 weeks, it's a huge amount of resource and money.
Yeah.
It's really, really expensive. The Whakaari prosecution will be incredibly expensive. One day someone might do an OIA request to ask what the costs of it were, but
I'm sure they will. Yeah. You've just got me thinking, which is slightly off script in a way, but I think it's quite a timely point to raise. Is just in the last few days, there's been media span outcry. Some politicians seem to have jumped on the bandwagon too around the leveling doubt or putting a question mark around how the young man who brought a weapon to the construction site in Auckland CBD subsequently killed 2 workers, and then he himself was subsequently killed. There's this question in the public space around how the decision was made for that person not to be behind 4 walls
well, that's a really simple and easy answer, and actually ex-Judge Harvey has done a really good job on LinkedIn about writing about that, and you should go and look up on LinkedIn about it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yep.
Because the answer to that is that in terms of his offending and what he did, and to me it looks like domestic violence charges.
Okay.
There's withholding breath and a few other things there that indicate that potentially that was the case.
Yep.
his sentence was appropriate for the offending. That's what the conclusion that ex-Judge Harvey has looked at.
Yep.
He's also looked at what, and his article was about how it's entirely inappropriate for the public to have a crack at a judge about sentencing when they're not privy to the reports that are done by probation and all of those people and all the other things that fold into making up a sentence and deciding what's an appropriate sentence for a 24-year-old man charged with that offending.
Yep.
And the circumstances of the charges and that, because based on those charges, it appears that it was focused on one particular person, and also that you can't like now go. Like you couldn't charge his employers in relation to a health and safety incident in relation to this because what would be reasonably practical? What would be foreseeable? What would they know about it? Well, how did they know on that particular day that person was going to go and do that?
Yep.
This is just, as the judge said, this is somebody who's acting completely outside society's norms about what you would think. And the offending that was previously done doesn't indicate necessarily that this would actually have occurred. Now, the fact that people were triggered by the fact that, like people have said to me, oh, DeAnne, how can he actually be at work when he's got an electronically monitored sentence? People are at work all the time, and particularly on construction sites too. If they were a good worker and they got done for their fifth drunk driving and they're not going to jail but they're actually on home detention or whatever, then you sponsor them and say yes, they can come to work during work hours and work for us still because they're a good worker and they work hard and we don't have any problems in the workplace with them. So, of course, they can be back in the workplace. In fact, they're contributing to society and paying taxes and doing all that stuff, but they are subject to a sentence, you know. So no, that's what community detention-based sentences are about. That's why also when people get drunk driving convictions and have their license removed from them, they can still get a limited license to be able to go to and from their work.
Yeah, it's kind of breaking through that sense of black and white, right? And because the reason why I brought it up was because you're making it very clear that the decisions that are made in court, the people that are involved in helping the decision makers come to those conclusions, everyone is putting their utmost best effort into this. It's not as if it's something that's willy-nilly.
It falls within a framework, and the Sentencing Act sets out the framework, and it also limits the ability to, like, you can't give out maximum sentences to somebody if the offending is not commensurate or doesn't mean that they're at the highest level of offending in terms of that tariff. And you also, it's like saying, and I recommend also reading Judge Harvey, who, by the way, is very pro-national and very pro-freedom of speech, but is very anti the what National was suggesting about youth offending and also sentencing being really, really strict and all the rest of that. And he's quite clear that it's nuanced, it's finely balanced, and actually if you go in that other direction like some other jurisdictions have, where you actually have maximum sentences and that you create other problems, significant social problems and other things. And it doesn't actually necessarily bring about change in behaviour either.
No.
So if you want to rehabilitate people, etc., you've got to look at the whole picture and what's causing it in the first place. Look, I work in Shortland Street, and Key Street's not very far away, and that's where my supermarket is. And this is, and Thursday was a pretty awful day, and people were pretty appalled and upset, and I completely understand that, and I get that, and I get it too that it's easy to strike out and say, well, why was he, why was he out and about and all the rest of that? Well, why was he so unwell that he did that?
That's right. Yeah, it's 20 plus years adding up to that day, right? Yeah. Yeah.
You know, what led up to that day? What caused those things to happen?
Mm.
What mechanisms and interventions and that were put in place for him? What procedures were followed? Was he let down in any way? Has the system
Mm.
let him down? There's a heck of a more,
Mm.
yes, some innocent people have died, and that's actually
Mm.
awful. It's awful.
Mm.
And,
Mhm.
that is not what you want to hear, that your partner was shot as
Mm.
they
Mm.
walked down the street and all the rest of that.
Yeah.
That is appalling. It's unconscionable, and it's
Mm.
painful for people to hear that and to realise that that happened in New Zealand.
Mm.
But I think
Yeah.
we need to be a bit careful about jumping to sort of conclusions about things
Mm.
like sentencing and judges and that sort of thing, because
Mm.
we weren't there. There's a number of cases where I've been appalled,
Mm.
particularly in relation to sexual assaults and that, with the sentences that have been
Mm.
handed out.
Mhm.
One being the young man in Tauranga with multiple sexual assaults.
Mm.
But then I read the sentencing notes and I could understand what was put in place, which was a really extreme supervision regime
Mm.
over
Mm.
that young man.
Mm.
Um, so while on one hand it looked like it wasn't enough, on the other hand his life was actually going to be severely controlled for like
Yeah.
a number of years.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, thank you for sharing that. I guess the key takeaway there is that it isn't, and it can't be as black and white as some are kind of attempting to lead the public to believe, right? That there is just so many other factors that we just will never have a grasp
Well,
of.
we just need to tie ho and not be driven
Mm.
by our feelings and not be
Mm.
driven by being appalled about the event
Mm.
and what happened,
Mm. Mm.
and not jumping to conclusions about
Yeah. Yeah.
things.
Mm.
Um, and in the fullness of time, all of that will become quite clear. I'm sure
Mm.
that there'll be a lot more investigation into this and what happened and why and
Mm.
what had gone down in the workplace and what caused him to do that on
Mm.
that particular day.
Yeah.
But at the moment, we don't know, and so it's like I've said to some of people that talk to me. All of this sort of supposition and all of this sort of connecting dots together, and that doesn't help anyone.
Mm. Yeah. 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 Of course. Wow. Hey, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
It's been amazing as ever. Thank you. I think in terms of the recognition of preserving what time you've got left in the day, I feel it's only fair for me to let you get back to it. But thank you once again for sharing so much valuable insight. I know
You're
everyone who
welcome.
tunes in is going to get so much from this. So thank you.